Welcome, everyone. Tonight we are here, or tonight for us, good morning for you, to talk about enhancing academic writing with AI, artificial intelligence. And we're really going to focus on balancing how to ethically produce your productivity while aiming for quality. A little bit about us. So I'm Dr. Jessica Parker. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Moxie. We are a generative AI company. We build formative feedback tools for early career researchers and graduate students. I also have two academic consulting companies where we work with PhD students across the US. And I'm also a doctoral supervisor at the Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences, which is in Boston, Massachusetts. I supervise doctoral students who have professional degrees and are now getting a terminal degree. So I work across disciplines with pharmacists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, acupuncturists, nurse practitioners, you name it. And everything we talk about today are things that we're actually doing in practice, either at Moxie through our research or through my work with my doctoral students. Kimberly, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Kimberly Becker, and I'm in Ames, Iowa. Jessica and I are in two different parts of the country in the US. And yeah, I'm a co-founder of Moxie, and my background is in applied linguistics and technology. So I have taught at the community college, high school, community college, and university level. I study disciplinary academic writing and corpus linguistics, and usually the applied part of my linguistics is that I am a writing coach and I help people with specifically with their research writing. So not just academic writing, but specific to English for research publication purposes.
So this looks like a simple agenda, but we have a lot to talk about today. We're going to start by discussing this idea of productivity when we think about AI and academic writing. We're then going to talk about very specific techniques that you can use to improve the quality of your academic writing using AI. Notice that I'm not talking about speed, I'm talking about quality. And then we're going to talk about various ethical considerations when using AI in your scholarly work. We'd love to kick it off in the Q&A in the chat. Feel free to answer one of these questions. What AI tools have you tried for academic writing? Or what's your biggest concern about using AI in your work? Or what would make this session most valuable for you? If you could just take a moment to enter your responses in the chat, that would be really great. And I'm going to have Kimberly keep an eye on that. And when we get to a natural break in the discussion, we're going to address some of your responses. We'll start with writing productivity with AI. I want to start by just acknowledging a lot of the writing challenges that really anyone faces who is conducting research either for the first time or the 100th time. I continue to face a lot of these challenges. Synthesis is a big one, coming up with new ideas based on the ideas of other scholars and combining multiple sources. Writer's block is something that is very common. Argumentation, this really working against this idea that academic writing is neutral or objective. Structure and organization, that could mean outlining, that could be really zooming into the paragraph level or even the sentence level. Authorial identity, this is really how you identify as a scholar and as a researcher. Oftentimes as novice graduate students or PhD students, because you're not experts yet, you might really question your voice and whether you should have an opinion or whether you're getting it right, and that's authorial identity. And then audience engagement. We're always writing to a specific audience. And these are just really common challenges. They're just a few that we believe AI can help with in an ethical way, where you're not violating academic integrity norms. So when we talk about academic writing with AI, we are looking at it in terms of a spectrum. It's not a binary decision. Do you use it or do you not use it? We have on one end of the spectrum what we all know to be true, which is human writing. And then we have these sort of three new areas where you have human in the loop. That's a lot of the writing that we do as researchers is very human in the loop driven, where the human is making the decisions. We're driving the car, so to speak, in terms of how we're going to use the machine or AI. There's machine in the loop writing. This is often more appropriate for like low stakes activities. I know Kimberly and I use the example of sometimes we'll do machine in the loop writing when it's like a LinkedIn post or an email, because that's something that's low stakes. and then fully synthetic writing, that's fully AI generated writing. And depending on the type of task you're engaging in, you might fall at different ends of the spectrum. Here's an example of human in the loop writing. This came out of my work with my doctoral students. I conducted a participatory research study last fall with my doc students who were learning academic and scholarly writing. And I was particularly interested in really integrating AI slowly throughout the course and seeing what that meant for the new writing process that they were engaging in. So I allowed them to engage with generative AI. I did give them very specific boundaries in how they could use it, but otherwise I really just engaged them and had them meet with me periodically to give me feedback. I had them reflect and document their process. And this is really what came through, is this idea of you're collaborating with an AI. And so we all know that writing is a very iterative process. We typically start with ideating, we're brainstorming, and then we can go to drafting, we might go back to ideating. But then what's interesting is now we have this opportunity to use AI for maybe reviewing, acting as a peer to provide feedback on drafts. That's like formative feedback. Evaluation, AI can play a role in that as well, as long as you're critically thinking about the output. And then there's the typical revision process. And then sometimes you go back to ideating. So we know that this is a complicated, tangled web. It's not a simple circle or even a linear process. But in the center here, I think this is what's really interesting when we think about human in the loop writing. And this is part of what I've learned from Kimberly as a linguist, is this idea of meaning negotiation. When you're interacting with an AI, and in this case, I'm specifically talking about like an AI text generator, an AI chatbot, we're continually negotiating meaning. So the real gold, the gem of that process, is not just asking a question and getting a response. It's asking for clarification, asking for explanations, correcting it even. And so as long as you're negotiating that meaning throughout the process, then you're going to get the most out of that interaction. And so this is just one example of what human in the loop writing might look like when you're engaging with AI. When we think about productivity, there are, and this isn't even the full stack, but there are so many AI research assistants coming onto the market. I hear about new ones every day. We're constantly adding new logos to this slide. One that I love is LitMap, so I'm going to use that as an example, but as you can see, there are many. And these AI research assistants all have different features. They're all powered by different LLMs, and they have a different corpus, and they all do very similar, but also slightly different things. And in terms of productivity, I think about this in terms of working smarter, not harder. So it's not necessarily speeding up the literature discovery process. It's just another tool in your toolbox to help you find literature that's relevant to your research topic. So we have a little table here. I'm not going to go into detail with this, but a lot of people like this table, so we're including it in the presentation, which you'll get a copy of. These are just us comparing a few of the most popular AI research assistants in terms of their key features and the data corpus they use. And keep in mind that the data corpus is evolving. So you could think of the corpus as just the database, what literature they're pulling from whenever you ask it to give you search results based on whatever your research topic is or your keywords are. A lot of these use Semantic Scholar, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and a limitation of Semantic Scholar, but feel free to look at that whenever we give you a copy of this presentation. Let's just look at one of these. This is my favorite, which is called Litmaps, and that's because I'm a visual learner. And so that's what I mean. A lot of these tools do the same thing, but they have different features that appeal to different preferences that you might have. So with Litmaps, you go in and you can ask a question, you can put in your keywords, you can just put in a few concepts. And what it's immediately going to do is produce a map for you. And their whole value proposition is that they help you find what they call a seed article. You might also think of this as a seminal piece of research where a lot of research has emerged from that article. And what they do in this interface is on the left-hand side is they give you a summary. And then on the right-hand side, along this X and Y axis, all those little bubbles represent a source. And when you look at the bottom, we see how current. The further you go to the right is the more current it is. And on the other side, the further you go up is how well cited it is. And so visually, this helps me significantly as a researcher instead of just scrolling through lots of search results. Lit Maps does have a paid version of their product, but like many of these companies, they give you access to it for free so that you can try it out. I highly recommend checking out different AI research assistants before you commit to one or go all in on any sort of annual subscription. But this is just one example of how you could leverage these AI research assistants in terms of productivity and just making sure that your research is higher quality and that you're finding everything that's relevant to your topic. One key way that these tools differ from, say, a traditional semantic search like Google Scholar or your library database, keyword search. So typically when you go into your library databases, it uses your keywords and it'll scan and will look for a match of those keywords in the title and the abstract. And that's why part of your search strategy involves identifying synonyms or using wildcards or truncation. AI is able to scan the entire article and automatically do that. So it makes it a little easier to find literature that is relevant to your topic. So often I'll find articles that I didn't find during my normal search process. And so we're definitely not advocating for replacing it. I'll show you a graph in a moment that talks about triangulation. But let's really think about the database. So Semantic Scholar is a database that's used by many of these AI research assistants. It's the primary one, and that's because it's open source, it's open access. And when you look at the literature that's included within their database, you can see here, and these are in the millions, most of them, 60 million, are uncategorized. So we don't even know what discipline they represent. And then the next category, as you can see, is medicine, and then biology and physics, and you can just see it go down. And again, these are in the millions. So I pointed to linguistics because that's Kimberly's discipline, 1.1 million. Why do you need to know this? If it's not obvious to you, I really want to point out what the limitation would be if you were not looking at the database that's powering the tool. You might inadvertently be using a tool that's not built for your discipline. And so it's important to do your homework and look at the database that's being used to power these AI research assistants. Oops, that clicked on the study. And so oftentimes we think about a gap in the literature, but with these AI research assistants, a gap could be in the corpus, not just the literature. And this came to me because I had a student in the humanities who was using Cite AI, which is predominantly for biomedical research. And they came to me and they were like, there's nothing on this topic. And I was like, that's because you're using Cite and it doesn't have literature in the humanities. So that's not a gap in the literature, that's a gap in the corpus, and there is a difference. And it's really important to point that out because we're definitely being sold on this idea of productivity and efficiency and optimization. And a lot of times these limitations of these tools are not being advertised for us. You have to dig for this information. And it's really important, again, to understand the difference between a gap in the corpus and a gap in the literature. So when we think about how we use these tools, I have this triangle because I like to use this idea of triangulation. I still use Google Scholar as I normally would, library databases as I normally would, and then I just add on AI research assistants. Normally I add that in last, and I'll just end up finding additional sources that I didn't find through my normal search process. And so this idea of triangulation is really critical. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly, and she's going to talk about some very specific techniques that you can use.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so just to start us off, if you can advance the slide, I just want to see what your ideas are about what is a strong marker of human written academic writing. Because as we have more AI writing coming to us, either from students or possibly even in publications, I think it's really important that we know what strong human writing looks like so that we can start to differentiate. We are not advocates of AI detectors at all. They're quite inaccurate. We don't have anything about that in this particular webinar, but we have a lot of webinars on YouTube. And if you want to know more, we have a whole series on AI detection, and you can find out more about that there. But yeah, I'm just curious, when you are maybe grading student writing, if you're a professor, or if you are a graduate student, what kinds of things are you seeking to do in your writing? And I'm just going to keep on going after you.
I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, actually, while they're talking, I did want to say, Jessica, in case you don't have time to read most of them are very new to AI, and they're not using very many AI tools yet. They're a blank slate, so to speak, many of them. Yeah, so this diagram shows one of many frameworks for understanding writing, and it actually comes from a study of second language writing, which is my field. But I use it because, as an academic writing coach and a researcher, I believe that academic communication is like a second dialect. Nobody really speaks it as a quote unquote home or native language. And so it's relevant as we are either learning how to do it ourselves or teaching students how to do it. And so the framework has three aspects and they vary in terms of their importance. And the very top of the inverted triangle is depth. Depth has to do with the variety and range of language ideas, sources, and analysis that you are using. And so depth is labeled as number one because this is where you always want to start with your writing. And it's what gives your writing that really human element. I'll show you in a minute, but what we know is that AI is pretty good at flow and pretty good at accuracy. And so depth is important and it's the largest area of the triangle because of that. And because it really allows us to get that sophistication and complexity that needs to be in scientific writing. Flow is the second element, and that has to do with the smooth expression, clear connections, and fluency of communication. So, how the ideas are connected. And accuracy is the final kind of tip of the triangle, which has to do with precise mechanics, spelling, grammar, punctuation, and citation format. If you have been thinking that precise mechanics, spelling, grammar, punctuation, citation format is what makes you a weaker writer, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. Those are very surface level issues, and technology is actually really good at helping us in that domain. And so the order that we usually present when I'm coaching, I talk about is save the accuracy piece for last. And so because of that, today we're going to talk really about depth. And I want to show you some aspects of depth that I think will help you. So there's some new research that's come out, a couple of new studies exploring differences in text generated by machines or AI versus humans. Of course, I'm very interested in this. These studies compared linguistic features, and they're the basis of much of what we're going to talk about here in this next section. These are topics that you can see a lot of in our YouTube channel, but I want to go over these because I think it's really critical that we start to know what to look for as the world gets populated with more and more machine or synthetic writing. So the markers of generated text are here. There's four primary ones. Lack of depth is number one. And again, that goes back to that inverted triangle. So AI can produce text that is coherent and grammatically correct, but it typically lacks the depth and nuance necessary for original arguments or complex interpretation. I noticed that many of you wrote something about argument in your answer here on the chat, and you're definitely onto something. That's where the complexity comes in. Mechanical perfection, or sometimes I call this synthetic accuracy or precision. This is when, and you've probably seen this if you used an AI before, it outputs this thing that is it looks okay on the surface, right? It's grammatically perfect. There's really nothing that you notice immediately, maybe some repetition, maybe some words like delve. Everybody is picking on the poor word delve. It's getting a bad reputation. But AI basically produces sentences that on the surface look okay. And that's what we mean there. Repetition, I've already said that. Redundancy, lots of repeated words. And if you give it something in the prompt, it's going to pick up on that and then duplicate those words throughout its own generation of text. And then the last one is just this absence of personal insight and emotion. Of course, AI is lacking completely in personal experiences. It has no feelings. And so it's missing that personal touch or emotional depth. Even in academic writing, we have some emotional rhetoric involved in the language. So let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper now into some of these features and talk about what constitutes depth. A lot of my research has been related to this idea that academic writing is not objective. We think of science as this objective, faceless thing, but it's not at all. It's really argumentative because it's acknowledging and constructing and negotiating all these social relations of the other researchers. It is a conversation between scholars. And so to do that, we use stance features, we use evaluative features, and we acknowledge alternative views. And so with that in mind, I did a webinar a few weeks back on, and the title of this is a little misleading, How to Assess Writing Without AI Detectors. But what it does is it goes into depth on all of these things I'm going to tell you. It dives even deeper. So if you're interested in any of this, I'm going to scratch the surface, but you can dive deeper through this webinar. Let's start with stance's positionality of an author to a topic amidst all the other voices. And by voices, the sources that they are citing. So this is where we evaluate the subject matter, we assess the status of knowledge, and we manifest our position or stance through certainty and doubt. So if we're taking a very neutral position, the reader is questioning, okay, whose side are you on here? Which direction are you driving the car? And so stances are really important. And what we know about novice versus expert academic writers is that novices tend to do things like they boost their language a lot, so they don't add a lot of hedging and doubt. And that's what I'm talking about when I say their novice writers tend to be very certain. And if you've ever taught like freshmen, undergrads, or in high school, like 12th graders, the highest level of secondary school, they're very certain about everything. And some of that is developmental, but a lot of it is just not really understanding how to use doubt or hedge their writing and be careful about their claims. So I'm going to walk you through now some AI generated writing, and I'm going to show you how to inject some stance and some other depth features into your writing. Let's imagine that you're using a very popular AI writing tool that's called Quillbot. Quillbot looks something like this. It's actually free. You can type a little bit in it and then a little pop-up over on the side. As you can see, yes, that lightning bolt. You can click that and this pop-up comes up and it says, generate ideas, complete this paragraph, start a new paragraph, add an example, etc. And so I did this with some writing. I continued or just finished a paragraph there. And if you'll go to the next slide, I'll show you what I put in. Now, this is some writing that we had. This first top paragraph there is fully human. This is our framework for AI literacy in higher ed. Jessica and I have published a white paper on this. And so you can see that it's related to what are we going to do, the debate, the controversy about the rapid adoption of AI in higher ed, and basically this issue of educators and students learning to understand it. And at that point where you see the ellipsis mark after the word technologies, I clicked finish the paragraph. And this is what Quillbot generated. So I've bolded words that show repetition, basically educators and students. It's repeating higher ed. It's repeating gaps in understanding. It's repeating the word leverage. And some of you said repetition, not duplicative language and that sort of thing. And that's for sure what's happening here. And this is very common in AI writing. And so now go ahead to the next slide. You can see that as the human editor, I have now come in after Quillbot and I've added some stance features. So instead of repeating students and faculty or educators and students, I changed the word to stakeholders. Stakeholders has a little bit of a stronger meaning behind it. It shows that people value this and that they have a stake in what's going on. Instead of saying they should, I've changed to it is critical to carefully consider. So you can see that I'm like enhancing the language here with stance features. And again, if you're not sure what stance features are, you can go to that webinar and you can watch me dive deep into what are these features and how do I get them in my writing. You could also ask an AI to help you understand stance and to generate some ideas for how you could inject a stronger or a weaker stance in your writing. I'm not saying it needs to be strong necessarily. I'm just saying you need to have a control over that doubt and certainty. So I won't say much more about that, but you can see there that I have improved it to some extent. Another kind of depth that you can inject back into writing that maybe has been output by AI. And this goes for, I'm speaking to two different audiences here. If you're using AI to write, this is a consideration for you. But also, if you're evaluating writing from as a peer reviewer or as a professor of graduate students or any students really, and you're trying to decide, is this AI generated or not, or what do I need to say about this? These are some features that you can and start to figure out because, as I said, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more generated text. Self-identification is another depth feature. It has to do with how the author overtly inserts their identity amongst the voices. This is something novice research writers really struggle with, and it has to do with their power dynamic between asserting their voice in the disciplinary conversation. And so it's really difficult to do. It's hard to disagree with somebody who's a seminal author in the field. Even if you're an established researcher, it's difficult to do that. This is reflected through personal perspectives, which again, AI doesn't have. And so you're on the up and up there because if you're competing with an AI, it doesn't have any personal perspective. It provides connections to the writer's experience or opinion, and it's marked with reporting verbs. So if you go to the next slide, here's a list of ways that we do this. We're starting to see more first person pronouns like we and I in research writing. We used to not see that at all. We're starting to see more active voice in research writing. It used to err on the side more of passive voice, especially in the biomedical sciences. Clarifying they say and I say is a big one for novices. And if you're not familiar, there's a great book called They Say, I Say. And if you're training beginning academic writers, it's a great book to have. And then, as I said before, reporting verbs, which the next slide has a list of for you. This is one of the things I tell my students, and I noticed some of you said no repetition. And this is what I tell my students. I say, I don't want to see a reporting verb twice at all. I don't care if your paper is 30 pages. There are so many reporting verbs, you never need to repeat one. And so you need to decide, do you want to be tentative? Do you want to be assertive? Or are you taking some kind of neutral literature? So that's just a quick resource there for you.
And I also want to chime in, Kimberly, and say that even if you're not using any sort of AI generated text, which we're not necessarily promoting, we just have different audiences here, you can use AI to help you evaluate your writing for this. You can say, hey, I wrote this. Is it coming across as neutral or assertive? Or help me identify all of my reporting verbs and then categorize them. And maybe visually you see that most of your reporting verbs are in the neutral category. And then you can be really intentional about how you go in and revise and check your claims to see if you want to be more assertive or maybe a little more tentative. So it's not just a matter of writing in this way or telling the AI to write in this way. You can use the AI in all of these situations to act as like a peer reviewer to evaluate your writing for these specific features of stance.
Yes. So on this slide, you can see I have that same paragraph that I started with as the human. And then we have the Quillbot generated text. You've seen that kind of hot pink or magenta colored, those stance features. And now I'm adding self-ID or authorial voice features here. And this is where you get into citing other literature or asserting your own voice. And so you'll see the use of many scholars have asserted, and then you see those first person pronouns, we and us. It's not much, but it adds a little bit of depth that it's not a difficult thing, but it really sets the writing apart from what it looked like before. Okay, engagement markers. Engagement markers are strategies to involve the reader. I think a lot of times we are so inside our heads as writers that we forget about what the reader might have as a question or where the reader is coming from. Certainly with students, this is an issue, and really shifting their attention to audience is an important aspect of their development as academic writers. But engagement markers make the writing more interactive by addressing the readers, anticipating their knowledge or their reactions, and noting where something is maybe surprising or unfortunate or disappointing. Maybe your hypothesis didn't turn out and you're surprised at that. So this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. This guides the understanding or the response of the reader. And so on the next slide, you can see that I have added now self-ID into this Quillbot generated text so that it has stance, it has engagement, and it has Sorry, I think I missed one. It has, we didn't, this should say engagement at the top of the slide, not self ID, but that should say engagement. And so if you'll see in the middle there, this blue have led to practices the reader is likely familiar with, such as bans on AI, the use of AI detection, humanization tools, demonstrating how people might misuse the technology. And then there's like a rhetorical question dropped in there. So how will higher education adapt? So it just makes it a little bit more interactive. And I think we shy away from that as academic writers. We think it needs to be very dry, but I think that's what makes us, our human writing, stand out. And so I encourage you to learn a little bit more about engagement and start to use it in your writing. And so what we really have here is we have some promises and some marketing kind of language, and then we have reality. Basically, all of these companies are going to promise some form of productivity enhancement in the way of faster, better, quicker, all of those things. They will say polished, they will say easier, and maybe those things are true, but at what level are you achieving that? Is it at a level of depth? Or are you just scratching the surface? Here's a couple of examples down at the bottom. Elicit, which is a lit search tool. They advertise superhuman speed. And I'm not sure if you can see the one for consensus down at the bottom, but it says find and understand the best science faster. I'm not sure we want to speed up certainly individually, yes, I want to speed up the parts that I don't like and get to the stuff that I do. But scientific rigor and speed don't exactly go together. And Jessica and I have some concerns about, this is shifting over to the reality, the loss of context, because context really matters. The perhaps decontextualization of field expertise. So an AI is not a disciplinary expert in any way. The fact that quality varies so widely. If you tried ChatGPT when it was in version 3.5 and you've tried it now, there's a huge difference. If you haven't, if you didn't try it then and compare it to now, you should, because it's gotten markedly better. And then, of course, there are some ethical considerations.
Yeah, let's talk about ethical considerations. Simplification bias is something that Kimberly and I have recently been digging into a bit more. And what that really just means is like the tendency to oversimplify something that's complex, leading yourself or even the reader to an inaccurate or incomplete picture. And we stumbled upon this because one of the first papers we published last year, the first paper we did publish on generative AI, has been cited quite a bit. And now ResearchGate has a feature that uses AI where it sends me snippets of how that study has been cited by other scholars. It'll highlight the sentence. And as I see those snippets come through, maybe half of them have been incorrect. They've made an incorrect claim about our research. And so it made Kimberly and I curious. We know that this has always been an issue in research, but we're concerned that AI, with it's often summarizes really complex papers, multiple at a time, and produces this neat little summary for you. Most of the AI research assistants do this, or if you upload an article into ChatGPT or Claude and say, summarize this, you are very likely going to see some degree of simplification bias in what is returned to you. And this is an ethical consideration, especially when we think about the context of healthcare. And so ultimately, this is like a context crisis. Through the simplification, this quick summary of information, we are losing the context and the complexity because the focus becomes on optimizing, reducing friction. We miss that crucial nuance. We're stripping away context, and yet AI generates really plausible sounding text because it's very confident. I think that's partly why some people will get this AI generated text and they don't question it. I have even fallen prey to that. I recently started using a tool that's being beta tested by Stanford University. It's called Storm, and they're doing research on it. So it immediately asks for you to consent for it to track your cats. And because of the name Stanford, it definitely lends itself to some credibility. That's a really prestigious institution here in the US. And You just give it a question and it'll generate an entire research article for you with hyperlinks to sources. I immediately noticed that over half of them were linked to sources that were either completely unrelated to the claim that was being made or somewhat tangentially related, but the claim was overstepping in some way. And so this is the simplification bias in real form, and it's like an AI context crisis that we're very concerned about. And so Kimberly added this in. I'm going to let her explain this because she's the one who's a linguist and she's familiar with the linguistic framework theory, relevance theory.
Yeah, so there's this relevance theory from linguistics, and it's really more like a philosophy that communication relies on a shared context. And for example, if I were to call my husband right now and say it's raining, he would know that probably means something like I don't have a raincoat or I don't have an umbrella and I've got to walk to my car because I'm at work or something like that. But you would not know what in the world I was meaning with it's raining because you don't have any shared context with me, not for that situation. And it's the same in scientific writing. People in the same discipline have a shared context of methodology, of benchmarks for evaluating certain items, variables that you're researching. And so, oftentimes, as experts, we will omit that obvious information when we're talking to somebody in our discipline. If you are reading your journal and it's in your discipline, you'll notice probably that the methodology, there may be some things that are left out. However, if you are submitting something to an interdisciplinary journal, you have to be more clear about that because not everybody is sharing that same context as you. With an AI, there's no shared context whatsoever. And so a lot of things are getting lost, and we're calling that simplification bias.
So why do our brains accept this? Why are these AI companies taking off, selling these ideals around speed and efficiency and optimization? It's because from a psychologist's lens, like our brains want to accept this. We naturally seek efficiency. We fill in the blanks. We make assumptions constantly. And we prefer clear, simple narratives. That's just human nature. And AI tools definitely capitalize on these tendencies. So it's something to be aware of. It does not mean that you don't use or you reject the technology. It just means that when you go to use it, because we use a ton of tools on a daily basis, on any given day, I'm shuffling between 3 or 4 different AI tools, but I have all of this in mind. I don't take everything at face value. I'm highly critical of what it says. I don't just take everything as truth, even though sometimes it's very tempting to, because it would certainly save me time. And so when I use these tools, when Kimberly and I use them, and when we talk about using them, is not for speed or efficiency, but for quality. We really do believe that when you learn to leverage this technology ethically and responsibly, that you can produce higher quality ideas and higher quality research. And so what's happening right now that we're seeing is like this perfect storm where we have all of these AI tools that are optimized for core meanings. And then human cognitive bias, like we crave simplification. And there's always this pressure for research efficiency that's happening. Even though Kimberly and I are not on a tenure track, we feel it because we're in a field that's advancing so rapidly. We don't want to get left behind. And so the result is this systematic loss of really important context. And the only way to combat this perfect storm, to not get lost in it, is to have all of these limitations in mind and to be really thoughtful and intentional about what tools you're using and how. And that requires a bit more time, actually. It might add on time to your normal process in order to start learning to engage with these tools. I would argue that it's worth that time because we are increasingly in an AI integrated world and you need to use it in order to understand its capabilities and limitations. But please don't forget this importance of context. And so here's just an example of what this might look like across disciplines. So an AI or you might read a sentence that says, we used a mixed methods approach. If you're coming from the discipline of psychology, or if you're reading a journal about measures of psychological validity, different scales, you might inherently know that means qualitative surveys, quant surveys, and qualitative interviews. But someone in environmental science who reads that sentence might immediately think of field sampling and laboratory analysis because that context is environmental variable interactions. And in public health, your mind might go to epidemiological data and community feedback because you're thinking about population health determinants. And this is where AI falls short. It cannot put itself in your shoes as a disciplinary expert. And so that's where we have to give it that context. In order to get the most out of our experience with AI, we have to add in all of that context back to it. And so that's why oftentimes Kimberly and I, when we write prompts, they might be several pages long. And that takes a lot of time. And through writing those prompts, we actually find that we get a lot more clarity about what it is we're trying to say and what we're evaluating and what we're looking for. But when you're taking in the output from an AI tool, you have to remember that there's an audience. Who's the audience? Is it you? Is it someone else? And what is the context that might be missing from that sentence or that paragraph? So when we think about the application to research practice, think about these things like what disciplinary context is assumed. And this is one of the most common ways that I use AI is I ask for it to challenge what assumptions I'm making in my writing. Then you think about what methodological details matter. What implementation factors are really crucial based on your sample, your population, thinking about ethical considerations in research. And then what are the field-specific standards that apply? And all of these together, if you're using an AI and you have all of this in mind, then we do believe that you can navigate this AI landscape and use it ethically and responsibly for your research and your writing. And then there's citation acknowledgement. This is an ethical consideration. As Kimberly mentioned earlier, we do not support the use of AI detectors because they are very unreliable. We talk a lot about acknowledgement and citation. And the difference here is when you cite an AI tool, you would cite it in the same way that you would any other software. So typically that comes up maybe in your methods. We cited the use of ChatGPT in our methods. We had to say what version it was because we used it to analyze text in a corpus, just like you would if you were using maybe in vivo or SPSS. So that's how you cite it, maybe as a method. Acknowledgement is where you're acknowledging its role in the process. And this is becoming increasingly common. The last several articles we have published, we have added an acknowledgement of how AI was used in our work. And so I encourage everyone to just get in the habit of reflecting on their use of AI and start documenting it and start to learn. You'll learn more about yourself and your process and what works for you and what doesn't. And then the added benefit is you'll already have that information for an acknowledgement if it is indeed allowed for the venue you're submitting that text to. And then finally, data privacy. This is really important in healthcare. I work with healthcare providers. These ideas around HIPAA and PHI still very much apply. I do not recommend at all entering any identifiable protected health information into an AI. That would likely very much be a breach of confidentiality and data privacy. Even in data that is anonymized, I do not think it's ethical to do that. Then you think about research data protection. If you're working on a study and you have a novel idea, you want to make sure that new research data that you have, whether or not this is PHI aside, is protected and is not going to be identified by the organization the company that's created the tool that you're using. And so really getting in the habit of looking at the data privacy and security policies for the companies with the tools that you're using. And then that goes into just specific tool considerations. Like many large language models allow you to turn off your chat history in training. That means that the next time you log in, that chat will not be there. It disappears as soon as you log out. It's important for you to understand and start to do some homework on the different AI tools you're using to understand what's happening with your text and your data. This is more critical than ever, and it needs to be top of mind when you're using any of these tools. So we have some final moving forward recommendations, and then we're going to have a conversation with you. So this is all about augmentation, not automation. So you're thinking of these tools as supplements, not replacements for your expertise. You're continually maintaining deep engagement with the primary literature. So don't let the AI do the citing for you or the synthesis for you. Actively seek out missing context. Assume that there's missing context and then look for it. This is part of critical AI literacy. really critically examine summaries for oversimplification because it is out there. All of these AI research assistants are trying to give you a quick, simple answer to a very complex problem, and they're oversimplifying the sources they're pulling information from. And then document that context really explicitly in your writing. I'd say even more so than you're perhaps used to. That context is really key in this AI integrated world that we're finding ourselves in. So that is all. I'm going to stop sharing. I'd love to just be able to look at some faces and see what's in the chat and just have a discussion with the few minutes that we have left.
Thank you so much, Jessica and Kimberly. That was super interesting. So there's a couple of questions that I popped in the chat, but everyone else feel free to jump on and pop questions or to just unmute and turn the camera on so we can.
Yeah, feel free to unmute. We love talking and happy to read.
So one of the questions I had was around using good prompts, because I think when I first started using like Copilot and ChatGPT, I thought it was like Google. So I'd just type in a question. And actually, the more I use it, the more I realize you have to get really specific. And like you say, the prompts, you can be asking it to write one paragraph and you end up writing 2 paragraphs to get it to do the right thing. But yeah, so I was asking about resources. And so Kimberly's very helpfully put a YouTube video link there, which is great.
Yeah, Allison, to your point, though, we've been saying the word context, but now I'm going to use it in a different way. The reason many universities are struggling with this is because they want to create like an umbrella policy around AI use, and it doesn't make sense. It is highly contextual how it should be used. I think about like my first semester doctoral students. I don't want them jumping in and using generative AI right away. So I scaffold it. Whereas my final year students who've done their original research and they're getting ready to defend, I give them a little bit more leeway because they have now become more of an expert in the discipline. And so it's all about the level of the learner from a learning context and what are the learning outcomes. It is making us rethink assessment. But then if you're an expert, I find that when you're an expert in your discipline and you already know the literature, it makes it so much easier for you to spot those inaccuracies way faster than someone who doesn't know the literature. And I think it is perfectly fine for you to maybe start with some machine in the loop and have it generate something. I struggle with writer's block, but then I go in and heavily edit it and it might not look anything like what the original output was. And so it is really dependent upon the situation.
And I really liked the idea that you don't have to use it to generate writing. You can use it to evaluate your own writing. And that idea of being really specific and say, find all what they were called, reporting verbs and classify them and tell me what tone I've taken here is really cool, because that's the sort of thing when, if you haven't studied linguistics and writing, often you don't even, I've never even heard of a reporting verb. So to be able to go through and be a bit more deliberate about some of those things, almost with kind of an AI writing coach, it's really, I think that's really exciting way of using.
Yeah.
Look for Moxie.
Yeah, well, feedback.
That's basically what Moxie does, is you come to the
Okay.
table with some academic writing and it's a feedback coach.
You can even use it. So if you notice a piece of writing that really stands out to you and you're like, oh, this reads so well, put it into an AI and ask it to break it down for you in terms of academic writing concepts. Like, what makes this a good piece of writing? Help me understand. And it'll point things out to you. Like, notice these strong transitions, these recording verbs, and then you start to expose yourself to new concepts and you can start to emulate that in your own writing.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Does anyone in the room have any questions?
Oh, yes.
I was wondering, online was asked about, do you recognize people using AI in their writing, even if they didn't acknowledge it or cite it? So can you tell?
Yeah, that we were working with a student who had submitted, as a doctoral student who had submitted some work, and she had failed the assignment and didn't understand why she had failed, because it has this surface level kind of synthetic accuracy to it and no depth. And so that's actually how we got the idea for that webinar about how to assess writing without AI detectors, because On the surface, you may or may not be able to tell. Students certainly can't tell if they have not read a lot of research writing, published research writing. And I personally can tell typically, but it's going to get better and better. Jessica, you want to weigh in on that?
And that would be presumably only if they've just used the content and copied and pasted. Whereas if you've gone through the process like you were demonstrating, of I put in my prompt, I've got some outputs, and now I'm refining it based on my expertise and my writings, then it becomes possible to tell that it's just given you a sort of fairly crappy rough first draft.
Yeah, if you think about that paragraph that was transformed by the time Kimberly ended with it, maybe there are a few phrases that were from the original Quillbot generated text. Like that would be difficult to tell. In this specific scenario that Kimberly's talking about, it was a student. The assignment required some reflection and connection to their practice setting, which was completely missing. And so that made it a lot more obvious. So it does depend on what's being written. But I think importantly, like I have tried to create a culture of transparency in my classroom because I need to learn and understand how my students are using it. And I just have an open conversation if I suspect it. And I just say, I just need you to walk me through your logic and your thinking and how you came to these ideas. And yeah, even my admissions office was talking about how a lot of the admissions essays this year seemed suddenly all very well written compared to years. Very well written, no grammatical errors or punctuation errors, but just really shallow.
Yeah. And Ainsley, did you have a question? I noticed.
Sorry, just trying to find the mute button. No, thanks. I've just been listening and enjoying it.
Okay, sorry, I noticed. Your camera popped up for some reason.
Oh, that's weird. Unintentional, sorry.
No, that's fine. We're at 10 o'clock, so I might wrap up there, but I was just going to ask one final question. Is there something you would recommend as a good sort of first step for someone who perhaps hasn't been seeing AI or has been using it, like Google, who's curious about using it for their writing? What would be kind of the first task you might think about suggesting they do?
I think it depends on what you're struggling with. I'm really big on using it intentionally for a pain point. So if you struggle with writer's block, jump in and brainstorm outlines for your writing. If you already have a draft and you struggle with revision, then feed it the draft and ask it to give you feedback on something, organization, structure, whatever it is, maybe some of your tendencies are in your writing, your argument, your thesis statement. I think asking for feedback is a good one because you're not asking it to rewrite for you. You can even put in your prompt, do not start correcting these issues, just give me feedback. But I think brainstorming and ideating is a really safe beginning place. I never get writer's block anymore. I used to really procrastinate writing tasks because I just could not sit down and look at that blank page. And that just doesn't happen. I feel like I have Kimberly beside me all the time. I'm just like brainstorming, ideating constantly. And I think that's a really low hanging.
So I know we've recorded the sessions, so for those who weren't able to join in person and who are listening to the recording, please feel free to send through questions to me and we can have a little bit of an FAQ document perhaps that goes along with it. And I'll circulate the link around school who couldn't join today.
Yeah, we'll make a copy of the resources and the presentation, PDF. Yeah, and thank you for having us. This was an honor to talk to all of you. We're really passionate about this work and we put out a lot of content on YouTube that's very educational. So feel free to follow us and check out our other webinars if you want to take a deeper dive into any of these topics.